This paper and presentation is part of a multi-pronged work in progress on the historic L.C. Anderson High School in Austin, Texas. Over the past couple of years, I have been working with the Austin Independent School District and the Alumni Association of the school on ways to recognize and promote the history of the school, especially the 1953 school building and stadium. We ultimately hope to nominate the stadium to the National Register of Historic Places and get a historical marker. Complicating the factor of the stadium's nomination is the fact that the 1953 school was recently demolished. Any thoughts or comments you may have for me on the significance of this stadium as a standalone historic property or historic landscape are welcomed. While I'm listed here in my affiliation with TxDOT, this work is actually done as a part of my volunteer work with Preservation Austin and the old L.C. Anderson High School Alumni Association. Despite its current reputation and promotion as a progressive city in the heart of Texas, Austin has been a racially segregated city for the majority of its existence. The city had a blended settlement pattern in the beginning, although a strong African-American contingent lived in East Austin, which is considered to be east of East Avenue. Because this presentation is on a football stadium as a cultural landscape, I am going to focus my time this morning on the segregated sporting institutions of Austin, especially at a high school level. Austin was home to the white University of Texas and two black colleges, Samuel Houston College and Tillotson College, a teacher's school. Samuel Houston College fielded sports teams, including a baseball team, at the beginning of the 20th century. The college owned a playing field in deep East Austin at the dead end of a dirt road. The semi-professional baseball team, the Austin Black Senators, shared the Samuel Houston Stadium for their baseball games, while the white Austin Senators played at Riverside Park, just south of downtown Austin. In addition to the semi-pro and college baseball teams, the Samuel Houston Stadium was also shared by L.C. Anderson High School, Austin's African-American high school. As Kim McKnight mentioned briefly yesterday, Austin's 1928 city plan had a significant impact on the cultural landscapes of Austin today, especially on the African-American cultural landscapes. The plan laid out opportunities for paved roads, new bridges, and improved wastewater treatment. It suggested construction of an airport, a new auditorium, and the development of Austin's Shoal Creek Boulevard. And the plan suggested the creation of a Negro district, concentrating city segregated facilities only in East Austin. The 1928 city plan suggested the creation of an African-American park, which the city completed by purchasing and opening Rosewood Park in 1930. At its opening, Rosewood Park had 2 baseball fields, tennis courts, and a swimming pool. The park was much closer to the center of African-American activity in East Austin than the Samuel Houston College Stadium. The plan also recommended a Mexican-American park, which opened as Parque Zaragoza. And the plan recommended a, quote, complete Negro playfield in conjunction with the Negro High School to provide ample and adequate playground space and facilities similar to the white schools of the city, end quote. At the time of the 1928 plan, Austin's Black High School, L.C. Anderson, was in this 1913 building in East Austin. Anderson High School did not have organized sporting teams until the early 1900s, and those first ones were football and basketball teams. However, it wasn't until 1939, 10 years after the 1928 city plan, that Austin public school officials got around to implementing the recommendation for a playing field near Anderson High School. Their solution was to acquire the Samuel Houston College Stadium that Anderson was already using. Black leaders and parents protested the acquisition of this stadium, citing the fact that the stadium was over a mile away from the school on an unimproved road and forced the students to cross hazardous traffic arteries like an active railroad line. They requested Austin Public Schools purchase open land near the existing school. However, APS insisted that the open field near Anderson was too expensive to buy, and the Austin City Council refused to allow APS to use some of Rosewood Park as its stadium. So the purchase went through, and Anderson High School now had a football and baseball stadium with bleachers to seat 1,100 spectators, lights for night games, and restrooms. Across town was Austin High School, an imposing brick building for Austin's white students. Austin's sports teams first played on the University of Texas fields. However, there was a large open space adjacent to Austin High along Shoal Creek. It was called House Park after Edward House, who donated the land to the city in 1903 for the purposes of recreation for the city's white children. And white was specified in House's donation. Austin Public Schools then acquired House Park from the city in 1913 and began using that as the official playing fields for Austin High School. The stadium first had wooden bleachers and then concrete stands in the 1930s that could seat close to 6,000 people. So, in contrast to Anderson Stadium, that was 1 mile away, House Park was adjacent to Austin High School. So here's East Avenue again, but here's Austin High School, here's House Park. Students were able to walk to their stadium for practices and games without ever having to cross any of those hazardous traffic arteries. So clearly the situation between the two schools was unequal. And this really served as the status quo in the city until about the late 1940s, early 1950s, when the nation as a whole started undergoing a change. This was when the NAACP was challenging the notions of this separate but equal in graduate school and university levels, and they were winning their lawsuits because it was very obvious that things were not equal to one another. Heman Sweat was suing the University of Texas at Austin to enter its law school because the state of Texas did not provide any law school for its African American students. And the Austin Negro Citizens Committee was going to the school board on a regular basis complaining about conditions at L.C. Anderson High School. They were highlighting the poor heating conditions, the overcrowded cafeteria, the fact that students had to walk a mile to get to their recreational and playing fields. And so school districts across the South, including in Austin, began to improve their schools for Black students, hoping that these new school buildings would then stave off any desegregation lawsuits. And so in 1953, Austin Public Schools opened a brand new L.C. Anderson High School. The school was on a 21-acre site in East Austin, high on a hill off of Rosewood Avenue near Boggy Creek and Rosewood Park. The school had 8 regular classrooms and multiple specialized classrooms for things like art, accounting, agriculture, physics, chemistry, and speech. The new school had a cafeteria, a gymnasium, a library, and the new school had a new sports stadium, this time right on the grounds adjacent to the high school. The new stadium was home to the Anderson Yellow Jackets football team, their track and field team, and to the award-winning marching band that Anderson High School had. The stadium sits in a bowl with the campus on a higher elevation. You can see some of the school buildings up here. When the stadium opened in 1953, Yellow Jacket Stadium had bleachers, had lights, had a field house for student equipment and locker rooms, had a concession stand and a track. 2 sets of concrete stairs led from the school building down into the stadium. There was a press box and a ticket booth. And the new Anderson High School Stadium was really the place to be for Black Austin. This was a community center. Since Anderson was the only high school for African Americans in Austin, almost the entire community had ties to the school, either as students, parents, teachers, alumni, or leadership of the school. The stadium was the place where parents and students attended football games and practices. They watched marching band performances and cheered on track and field athletes. Anderson High School was a member of the statewide Prairie View Interscholastic League, which governed the extracurricular activities of Black high schools in Texas. In Yellow Jackets Stadium, Anderson became state football champions in 1957. The community was proud of their stadium and their field, which was centered in the heart of Black Austin. However, the cohesion and celebration of the community around the new Anderson High School and Stadium did not last long. Less than 20 years after its construction, the Austin Independent School District decided to close Elsie Anderson High School in 1971. AISD argued that this closure was necessary to integrate the school system. And so they closed the school and bused all high school students to other high schools across the city. So this meant then that instead of having a community center in the heart of the community was now fractured. Not all of the students went to the same high school across the city. And then the stadium and this related school building sat empty, and it was a huge hole in the middle of East Austin's cultural landscape. This decision also ensured that there would be no more Elsie Anderson Yellow Jackets, no more Elsie Anderson High School state champions, and the community lost a critical institution and the physical source of a lot of its pride. The cultural landscape declined when the school closed. In 1982, the new Austin Community College moved into the old school, and they paved the stadium's field for a parking lot. The parking project also removed the bleachers that were on the campus, on the stadium. After ACC left the site in 1989, the AISD moved back in and opened the Alternative Learning Center in the school site, but they kept the parking. The buildings associated with the stadium, like the field house, the concession stand, and the restrooms were used for storage and left with minimal maintenance. However, in 1993, former NFL player Thomas Hollywood Henderson returned to his hometown. Henderson had played football for Anderson High School at the stadium, and he wanted to give back to his old community. And so he began to work with AISD, which really had no interest in the stadium or use for it, to return it to a center of community use and pride. So he raised funds to remove the parking lot concrete. He helped restore the playing field and installed an irrigation system. And so now the East Austin Yellow Jackets Pop Warner football team plays football at the stadium. In 1997, Henderson decided that he needed to restore the track as well, build a new track. And so to accomplish that, he went on a hunger strike, asking for funds to build the new track. He was successful once again, as you can see here, in his fundraising. His foundation has continued to operate the stadium and ensures that only community uses are allowed in the fields, and the stadium is open for use as a community exercise center. But today, the landscape is threatened once again. As I mentioned earlier, in 2019, AISD began the redevelopment of the old Elsie Anderson High School campus, and they're redeveloping it into a new high school campus. Because of years of neglect, poor initial construction of the 1953 school, and deferred maintenance, AISD insisted that the school building needed to be replaced. So the school is demolished and is currently a construction site. Yet the historic Yellow Jacket Stadium continues to hang on. AISD did add the stadium to its facilities master plan, which indicates future interest in using the site for public school football games or for field meets again. And so myself and the alumni of the old L.C. Anderson High School are interested in pursuing a National Register listing for the stadium, as well as a historical marker. And once again, the community is using this space for organized sport, as well as an informal exercise and gathering space. The Yellow Jacket Stadium is now the only historic place remaining associated with the African American Anderson High School in Austin. Former Anderson schools have burned or have been demolished, and the stadium still hangs on to tell the story of historic Black high school. But in other parts of the city, House Park is still in existence and still is used for high school football games. And there are other resources associated with telling the story of the white schools in the city. So the creation, but then the neglect, and then the reclamation of this historic landscape is a great story of Austin's segregation, especially in the realm of sport. Its significance lies in the story it represents of a historic community center, community pride, and one of the few places left in the city that shows Austin's failed attempts to provide separate but equal access in recreation and sport. Thank you. Okay. So I have time for questions.
Yes, we have time for questions.
What do you think, Greg?
Thank you. That was an amazing presentation. Thank you. And I'd be happy to help with whatever I can do in Austin to support your work.
Thank you.
I wanted to kind of talk about some of the issues you brought up around equity and the school district, because there's a similar, it's similar in that how complex issues around facilities that were established in the Jim Crow era, and how we recognize those as they move forward to redevelop. Another example in Austin are Rosewood Courts, which is a public housing complex, which was also a very contested case. So this is really more of a question. I think I don't think it necessarily has an answer, but I do think that as preservationists and people that are looking to interpret historic landscapes, I'm interested in how we can do so in a very careful way when and how we can move forward with respect to advocacy and interpretation and stewardship of sites that have very complex issues around equity and segregation and integration. So I'm kind of throwing it up in the air because I think they're very different. I think the L.C. Anderson is very different than Rosewood Courts, but it's similar in that you have people within the community that question preservationists when we talk about trying to preserve sites that they feel were never equal to begin with, per se, and how we kind of navigate that.
Yes, that's a great point, and thank you for bringing that up. You know, I had 20 minutes here, and I could talk about this for hours, but in my work with the alumni, you know, that the alumni are very hurt still about AISD's decision to close the school in 1971. That hurt and anger still lingers in the community. And so the alumni that are working with me and AISD are only a few people who have chosen to overcome that anger or try to get over that what they can. And Because the 1953 version of the Anderson High School was in very poor condition, it was neglected for so long, even the alumni they were not interested in preserving that because it was a reminder of the neglect, the lack of institutional investment in this. They thought the building, looked ugly. It had cracks. It was falling down. And they wanted, there to be a new school that students could celebrate what happened on that site and be proud of their school, as opposed to adapting what we as preservation, true, kind of pure preservation, thinks of as keeping. And so the community is, they're kind of torn about, whether or not it's a good thing that there's a new school and there's nothing left of Anderson, and also about what to do with the stadium itself and plans that the school district may have in the future to improve it. I know a lot of the alumni want it to start being used in the school district again as a community center, but that will mean additional changes to that cultural landscape. So how we look at kind of preservation through a National Register lens versus actual what the community wants and feels is important to preserve is a tricky thing to navigate.
We have time for one more.
Hi, Rebekah. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
You.
I'm speaking in my role as a City of Austin Historic Landmark Commissioner. I wanted to ask, looking through the lens of protection, have you considered seeking a local landmark designation for it? I know it would be complicated if it is an AISD property, but we only have one local historic district in East Austin, and so I just wondered if you had considered that designation as well.
I have. That's also been another kind of political question. The political, in Austin, we have, what's available to a lot of cities in a local property tax freeze, and as part for historic preservation, for the rehab of landmarks. And as part of that, AISD has bought in and allows for their taxes to be frozen as well. I'm not really clear on all this, so I could be saying it very wrong, but AISD taxes are part of that. And so there is some reluctance I found on the part of organized preservation in the city of Austin to kind of challenge AISD, and the fear that they will remove their support for one of the few financial incentives that locals have to preserve landmark buildings. So, and the alumni haven't ever really brought up challenging AISD in the fact of doing a local landmark, and I'm really kind of being guided by what they want versus what I want, which of course would be to get it to be a local landmark and stick it to the man, but it's not really my history. I'm just helping them tell that history, so I'm being kind of guided by what they want to do, which is to try very hard not to antagonize AISD so they'll continue to come to the table and work with them. All right, thank you for the opportunity